Hey everyone. Have you ever written a paragraph that just made you really sad because it was terrible and you wish that you could write a delicious one? Well, let me help you with that with today's informational writing skills video on organizing information with evidence. This is our proficiency rubric for today. Please pause if you want to read more about this rubric, but as always, we want to make sure that you can consider yourself proficient or highly proficient by the end of this video on writing effective, organized paragraphs. Our agenda for today is the piece paragraph, where we'll talk about the 5 parts: P for point, I for introduction, E for evidence, C for citation, and the second E for explanation. This video is going to be so long, it's going to be broken into 2, so I'm really trying to keep this as short as I can, so I will not be explaining things in detail. If you want more information on some stuff, please feel free to look it up after the videos. So, the piece paragraph is just a structure for clear writing and convincing body paragraphs in any type of essay. Each letter stands for a key part of the paragraph, which we talked about earlier. The P for the point, the topic sentence, I, introducing the evidence, E, the actual evidence, C, the citation, and E, explaining how it all works together. When you use piece, your writing is easier to follow, more convincing, and academically strong. Why should you use the piece paragraph format? Because it helps organize your thinking and make it stronger and more logical. It's going to strengthen your overall message because it'll help work everything together to support your claim with clear reasoning. It's going to build credibility because introducing sources and citing them properly makes you more reliable. And it's like a checklist for you to follow when you're writing it, and a checklist for your teacher when they're grading it. Just to be completely clear, when we talk about the piece paragraphs in body paragraphs, we're talking about these middle paragraphs in an essay. We're not talking about the introduction paragraph we did earlier. We're not talking about the conclusion paragraph we are doing later. We're talking about these middle paragraphs. These are the ones that will get this piece paragraph format. Okay? So the P is the point, and this is the topic sentence telling us what that paragraph is going to explain. It's going to help support the thesis statement of your entire essay, because remember, these are the middle paragraphs, and your thesis statement is generally in that introduction paragraph at the very end. So this point is just kind of explaining a reasoning behind the thesis statement. The rest of the paragraph should explain this point further. So when you write the point, make sure it is one of the reasons or details that supports your thesis statement. Make sure it is clear and fact-based. Please don't include any evidence yet, and let's look at an example. School should start later in the morning because it helps students focus better. So the sentence shows us what the thesis of the essay is, which is school should start later in the morning. So the whole essay is about why school should start later in the morning. But this point is going to talk specifically about student focus because it helps students focus better. There are different point examples. We're going to go through these really fast. So if you're doing a problem solution style paragraph, you might say, one challenge communities face when addressing food insecurity is the limited access to affordable grocery stores in low-income areas. So presenting one of the problems in your essay. If you're doing the compare-contrast writing for your piece paragraph, you might have in your point, while both community gardens and food banks aim to reduce hunger, they serve neighborhoods in different ways. So we are showing one contrast, just one of them, between 2 different groups. For cause and effect, your point sentence might look like, one major reason childhood obesity rates have risen is the increased marketing of unhealthy foods to young audiences. So this is exploring one of the causes of the topic, and we'll probably talk about the effects later. If you're doing the chronological order type of writing, your point might look like, in the early 20th century, the rise of factory work significantly changed how families balance time at home and labors. This is explaining one key moment in history, presumably talking about another point that happened later. And then for just a description style writing, you could say the heart of the rainforest hums with life, from towering trees to microscopic fungi, each playing a role in its fragile ecosystem. So this is just describing one detail about a specific topic. So we're going to be zooming in on this specific body paragraph to show you how these all work together. So your point will obviously be at the beginning. This one talks about how while both community gardens and food banks aim to reduce hunger, they serve neighborhoods in different ways. So just think of your point sentence kind of like the name of a cupcake that you're going to make. The red velvet tells you this is what you're going to expect when you're baking. And the same thing, the point sentence should tell you what to expect in the rest of the paragraph. Okay, let's look at the introduction. So this is just going to be where you introduce the evidence that you're using to support the point. The introduction should normally include the source that you got your evidence from and why it's credible or relevant, because you want to make sure your reader trusts your evidence before you share it. So when you write a good introduction, first make sure your evidence is actually credible. When you're trying to convince us it's credible, make sure it actually is. Mention anything about the source that people would find quickly trustworthy or honest. So if you're sure that most people will be like, oh, I trust that guy, make sure to mention the thing that people will find trustworthy. It's usually good to share the title of the source, or at least explain what it is, so people don't think you're just making stuff up. And the biggest tip is that it's not its own sentence. It's going to flow into the evidence, so I will show you what that looks like. A couple of examples of introductions might look like, for example, according to a 2023 study by the American Academy of Pediatrics, a respected medical organization focused on child health. Notice there's a comma, then a ... because we're going to have the evidence later. So this one's just describing what the source is and who created it, so you have an idea of where this evidence came from. Again, that's the point of the introduction. It might also look like Dr. Marlene Harris, a pediatric nutritionist and researcher at the National Institute of Child Health, explains in a report about how food advertisements influence children's eating habits by sharing that. And then we go into the evidence. Again, notice there's no period. This type of introduction can highlight the credentials and expertise of the author. So if the author themselves is super trustworthy, then maybe you can just point them out instead of just talking about the source. So in this example paragraph, here's our introduction. In her article, Growing Solutions, The Role of Urban Gardens in Food Access, journalist Kendra Lowe explains, and we're going to cross out that one part because it had a period in it and it shouldn't have. So just pretend it says explains, comma. And the introduction is kind of like the cupcake liner, because cupcake liners are essentially your introduction to the cupcake. And you want people to hand you a cupcake with a liner on it, because if there's no liner, how do you know you can trust the hands that have been touching your cupcake? You don't know that. In the same way, if you don't have an introduction in your paragraph, how do we know we can trust the evidence, right? Okay, speaking of evidence, let's talk about it. The evidence is obviously the quote or paraphrased information that supports your point that you got from somewhere else. It should be accurate, relevant, and specific. There's lots of different types of evidence, like articles, data, experts, scientific research, that kind of thing. One thing I want to talk about really fast is how to know that your evidence is credible. This chart specifically is talking about news articles, but you can use most of this for scientific research and other stuff. So there's 8 things to look for. So does it list the author's name, and do we know the author has experience? Does it provide links to other sources as evidence? Does it list the copyright date and publisher at the bottom? Are there multiple articles talking about the same information? Does it list a date, and is it current, 5 years or newer? I would argue 1 year or newer. Does it refrain from using emotions or opinions? Does it have an about us or contact section? And is this article from an actual news company? So these are the things that people generally agree shows that evidence is credible. So the more yeses you can say on this, the more credible it is. Down here in the rating, if you have 7 to 8 yeses, so if basically all of these are yes, it's very credible. Please use that source. If you can only circle 4 to 6, it might be credible, but it might not, so maybe look for a different source. And if you can only circle 0 to 3 yeses, please find a different one. It's probably not credible. So when you use evidence in your writing, make sure it actually supports the point in the sentence. Just because it's credible doesn't mean it's related to the point. Don't choose a long quote. You want to keep it short because most of the paragraph should be your explanation. So only choose the part of the quote that best supports your point. So if only part of it supports your point but not all of it, you can use ellipses and then just skip the parts you don't need, and I'll show you what that looks like. Do you know you can also just paraphrase, so write it in your own words rather than word for word if it's going to be clearer or more interesting if you explain it. And you won't need to use quotation marks if you paraphrase. And then just know you still don't need a period yet, and I'll show you why in a little bit. Some examples of evidence are community gardens create spaces where neighbors can learn from one another, ... and strengthen their local support networks. So notice we have an ellipses here, and that just tells us that there was more to this quote, but we took it out because we didn't need it. So that's how you use ellipses. Just replace that with the information you don't need. Or your evidence might look like Harris reports that children who watch more fast food commercials crave and request those foods more often than children who are exposed to fewer advertisements. Notice there's no quotation marks because this is actually paraphrased. I'm going to tell you that the original quote was very long and used a lot of big words, so this person decided to paraphrase in more simpler words and to make it a little shorter. Okay, here's our evidence. It's just the community gardens one we talked about with the ellipses. So I want to point out again that there are still no periods. So we started with in her article all the way down here. Not a single period. We're not counting these because these are being used differently. So think of your evidence like the base of the cupcake because it's kind of the point of the cupcake. The base makes it a cupcake. In the same way that the evidence makes the paragraph. This paragraph doesn't make any sense if you don't have the evidence to prove what you're saying. So it needs to be there. Okay, let's talk about the C, for citation. So the citation is just the reference to the source you got your evidence from. There's different types of citations. We're just going to use what's called the in-text citation. And it's going to be in parentheses and directly after the quote or the paraphrased evidence. There's a few different ways to organize this, like APA format, MLA format, Chicago. We'll use MLA format in this class. The reason that in-text citations exist is that you want to show your audience that the evidence is not made up. And so you want to give credit to the person or group who did the work to get that information. So when you put the citation immediately after the evidence, it helps people find where all the sources are. Because remember, this paragraph is normally inside an entire essay, and there's usually a bunch of different sources listed at the end. So the in-text citation just makes it easier for the reader to see where all the sources are located. And guess what? That period you haven't used in introduction and evidence will be used after the citation. So I'll show you what that looks like. In our first example, we have parentheses, Harris 89, parentheses, period. So there's our period at long last there at the end. Harris 89 is the basic citation, so Harris means this is the author's last name, and 89 means this is the page number, not the paragraph number. It's the page number where the evidence is found. And notice we don't have a comma here. Or your citation might look like this. So parentheses, quotation mark, voices of industry, quotation mark, parentheses, period. And you would use this if there's no author listed. Then you'll be free to just use the first few words of the title. Notice there's no number, and that means that the source must just be one page. And so if the source is one page, there's really no reason to put a page number because there's no multiple pages. So you can leave the one off. And finally, you might have a weird looking citation like this, and this is used specifically for videos or music where there's no page numbers, but there's timestamps. So it looks like the evidence over here started at 9 minutes 4 seconds in the video, and they stopped saying it at 9 minutes and 17 seconds. So when there's no page number, because it's music or video, use timestamps. And then for videos, that's usually when you use the name of the video, which is what you see here, the first two words in quotation marks. But if you're using a song, then that's when you'll use the last name of the person who made it. Okay. And then here is our citation here in our paragraph example. Notice it is parentheses low, parentheses period. So you'll see that low is the author's last name. And there's no number, meaning that this must be a one-page source. And there's our period at the very end. So think of our citation like knowing where you got your cupcake from. So if you see a mix that says Betty Crocker, we can usually be like, yes, I know where it's from, and it's easy for me to check the reliability of this, right? Now, if you had someone say, my cupcake came from some guy down the street named Don, okay, well, I don't know anything about him. I don't know if he's reliable. Can I trust this cupcake? See, we need citations. So citations make it easy for us to check reliability. And finally, we have E for explanation. So this is just explaining how the evidence supports your point, why it matters to the reader or the world. So think of your explanation as answering the reader's question, why should I care about any of this? You want to answer that in the explanation. So when you write a good explanation, this section needs to be the longest section. I usually like to tell people it should be longer than everything else combined. And the main purpose is it needs to explain the connection between the point and the evidence. So you want to assume that your audience needs you to explain the obvious, even if you think people already know it, because sometimes people don't understand it. So you have to explain it pretty simply. So, and you want to make sure that the reader cares about this information, so explain it in a way where they will. I'm going to show you just a few different explanation examples. So for problem solution, this quote shows that people living in low-income neighborhoods often struggle to find healthy food close to home. Without nearby grocery stores, families may rely on convenience stores that don't offer fresh produce. That's why any solution to food insecurity needs to start with improving access to nutritious, affordable options. So this explains, one, how the quote is connected to the point. It also shows us why should we care about this information, because low-income neighborhoods struggle to find healthy foods. They may rely on things that aren't fresh. And then it kind of shows us, what should we do about it? We should start improving access to nutritional options. I'm just going to show these real fast. Feel free to pause if you want to see some of the other explanation examples, but for the purpose of the video length, I'm going to just keep moving. So in our paragraph example, notice, as I said earlier, this should be the longest part. Notice it is longer than the rest of it combined. And again, this is just explaining the connection between the quote and the point, and it should show us why we should care about it. And your explanation is just like the icing and decorations on a cupcake. Without it, it's just a sad muffin. Without your explanation in the piece paragraph, it's just a sad paragraph where you might not really understand what's going on because no one's explaining it to you. So give it a little bit of your personality, like the icing on a cupcake, and explain it a little bit better. Okay, for example time, I'm just going to show you where things are located. I'm not going to go over the actual paragraph, but feel free to pause if you want to see another example. So just to remind you that this is a full piece paragraph. That first part is the P for point, so it's telling us exactly what the rest of the paragraph is going to be about. The second part is the I, that's our introduction, so introducing the quote and where it came from. The E, which is our evidence, so the actual evidence that supports the point. The C, which is our citation, letting us know where this came from. And then our E, our explanation, explaining how the quote and the point, or the evidence and the point, are connected and why the heck we should care about it. Okay. So I know this was really long, and I'm sorry, but hopefully you have a little bit better understanding of the different parts of the piece paragraph. So when you write your body paragraphs, you can say you feel a lot more proficient, and that maybe writing a piece paragraph from now on will feel like a piece of cake. So good luck writing your paragraphs, and I'll see you in the next video.